Since time immemorial, Indigenous people have lived, traveled, and traded in the Puget Sound region.
The Donation Land Act of 1850 to encourage westward expansion allowed American settlers to claim these traditional native lands.
The original terms of the Medicine Creek Treaty were inadequate and ultimately unaccepted by tribal leaders, resulting in war.
The Indigenous Voices Podcast is an extension of the award-winning Puget Sound Treaty War panel series from Fort Nisqually Living History Museum.
The podcast advances tribal voices in the telling of Puget Sound history and shares tribal knowledge and expertise with wider audiences.
Episode 1 of the Indigenous Voices Podcast focuses on the experience of being Native and how that informs one's understanding of the Puget Sound Treaty War. The Treaty War panel series in 2021 presented new concepts and new ways to think about the war. At times, it challenged popular understandings of the conflict, which has predominantly been told from a non-Native perspective. In our first episode, we wanted to take a step back.
Hello, my name is Warren KingGeorge. I'm an enrolled member of the Muckleshoot Indian tribe on my father's side, and on my mother's side, I descend from the Upper Skagit tribe.
Charlotte Basch seeds stat Puyallup chud yafti klatsip nehalem uyaish chud tweldi doof lila olb adi. My name is Charlotte Basch. I am a Puyallup tribal member. I also have lineage from Clatsop Nehalem on the Oregon coast. I work for the Puyallup Tribe's Historic Preservation Department, and I'm really excited to be a part of this and bring the story to a wider audience.
I'm Brandon Reynon. I'm the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer and Acting Director for the Historic Preservation Department for the Puyallup Tribe. I'm also a Puyallup tribal member.
Nettsie Bullchild, Nisqually Indian Tribe, Director of Archives and Tribal Historic Preservation Office, tribal member and tribal elder.
Hi, my name is Danny Marshall, and I am the current chair of the Steilacoom Indian Tribe. I've been working on issues supporting the cultural knowledge of our people since about 1980, and have a passion for making sure that the expertise of the tribal people is shared in a good way.
My name is Jennifer Ott, and I'm the Assistant Director at HistoryLink.org. Our first question we're working on is, how has your experience as a Native person shaped your understanding of the Treaty War? Warren, do you want to go first on this one?
Sure, I'd be happy to, Jennifer. So my experience as a Native person growing up in South King County on the border of Pierce County, just across the White River, I think it was pretty unique in my time. So to give people a timeline, I was born in 1965. I graduated from high school in '83. And so during that time of childhood and young adulthood, life as a Native person growing in this region was somewhat challenging. I think the experience of being a Native American, a Coast Salish, a Puget Sound Native American, had both its benefits, and also it had its downfalls as well. I mean, there was lots of challenges. There was lots of misunderstandings, I guess is a polite way to put it. There was a lot of misunderstandings because there was a lot of misinformation that was being taught in public schools, which was also, ironically, or not ironically, but was what was being said at home from my father was completely opposite of what was being taught in public schools. So we're talking about the 1970s, 1980s. And oftentimes they went in completely separate directions. So it was really difficult. And that's when growing up Indian, growing up Native, we really had to learn how to walk two trails. So one trail, was in today's 20th century society, and our assimilated society, and then the other trail was our Indian trail, our Native trail, and that's where we got a lot of the traditional teachings and traditional values that were shared. So growing up Native with these two trails side by side, that was interesting and very challenging. And so when I'm talking about our Native trail, that's where we learn about who we are and where we come from. The Native trail tells us that these are our grandparents, our great grandparents. These are our ancestors, great grandparents, etc. And this is where we come from. These are the river systems. These are the water systems. These are the trails. These are the resources that we valued and that we depended upon. And so, but we start to learn that, well, this other trail, all of this is being abused, and all of these resources are being exploited, and their values are different on that trail. And so they really clash. So my understanding of the Treaty War and its social issues that were and were not addressed, that's where a lot of the misunderstanding comes from. Avoiding conversations that should have taken place but didn't. As uncomfortable as those conversations are, they still need to happen, because we're coming to a new generation. It's been several generations since we've had candid conversations about what happened and what didn't happen. And I think it's important to get all those out on the table so that people can understand our Native perspective. Because my view on this is that this work took place, and we call that work. Work is a term that we use in our Native culture. Work is something that our ancestors laid down. It's the foundation of our identity in most times, in most settings. And so I don't want to step on the work of our ancestors who laid down the foundation of this village that we call Muckleshoot. And so there were lots of warriors, there were lots of families, there were lots of sacrifices that were made to create our humble little village here between White River and Green River. And so my understanding of the Treaty War is a lesson of great sacrifice, and also a lesson of the value of family, how important family is. I think there's lots of valuable lessons that we can relearn and continue to learn and share with our children and our children's children. So that's my take on that first question, Jeff. Thank you.
Sure. My experience is similar to, it's somewhat similar to what Warren had alluded to, but different in a lot of other ways too. I also grew up in South King County in Kent, in the Kent School District in the 80s and 90s, and had a mother who was of European descent. My father's Puyallup, and so like Warren had alluded to, walking both those paths and learning the histories of both was quite interesting, especially in school. I often got in trouble or told that when I would try to say, well, what about this from the Native side? It was, well, Indians are savages and they were hostile or are peaceful. Immigrants are just trying to find a place to live and trying to make a living here on this new land that was given to them by God. And it's like, but what about the natives that were here? Well, it was, and the native perspective was never given any weight. It wasn't really until like my mid through college when we started digging into the native perspective. And my dad always taught us the native side. We knew it as Mount Tacoma. We knew instead of Mount Rainier. Thanksgiving was salmon and berries, and we had turkey and stuff too. But we also focused. We were trying bridging the two worlds in our family. But we really focused on our native history and our native family history. And my dad always taught our family everything. Family is everything. Your family. You can trust only your family. And so as I started researching the treaty wars, and the only thing I knew about treaty wars growing up was that my dad, I was always happy about how our people, the Indian people, we battled and we attacked the city of Seattle, and so that was his big thing. That's all I knew about it growing up. But once I started working for the Puyallup tribe and started learning more about the battles that took place, it was amazing to see those characteristics that my dad infused in our family. You have to lean on family, and that's who the treaty battles took place. These are all family members. We learned real quickly as you start looking into the warriors on the native side. These were all families banding together to fight for the rights of Native Americans and in this area, and fighting for the lands, fighting for where families have always lived before this invasion. And so so having to bridge both of those worlds allowed me to understand where we were being told the history by the European on the European side, but being able to recognize that there is a second side to every story, and this side needs to be told. Even if you look on the websites from Washington State, it's all or the landmarks throughout Pierce County. It's all about savage Indians attacking these noble warriors, these noble soldiers, or these noble militiamen who were just there standing in a field and just happened to be attacked by these savage Indians, right? And so, as I started learning about the treaty wars, I noticed real quickly, man, we have to get this native side told. We have to have our story told from a native perspective, because I'm sick and tired of seeing all these attacks on our people who were there defending the lands that they grew up on, their families for generations grew up on, and they're being taken and stolen from them by people who were told that they were being led here by some higher power. Well, our higher power had put us here before yours, and so it needed to be told. Most European descendants can't say that they're a descendant of Moses or a descendant of Slaughter or a descendant of Stevens. I can tell you, and I know all the other natives on this call, they're a descendant of so-and-so. I'm a descendant of Hainuk, a warrior of this treaty war. So there is that family connection today too. People telling us story are descendants, the perspective of natives are descendants of these same warriors.
I've had very similar experiences with some of my non-native friends. Natives have a really deep-rooted history here, going back 14,000 years, even more, to the Ice Age. And whereas the tribes that are here in the Puget Sound area, have been here for generations and have a vested interest in all that you see around here, everything that grows, all the natural resources, the water, the air, the land, the rocks, all these things have a role in our history to remind us of who we are and where we come from. Whereas a non-native or someone from pre-treaty or settlement era of the Denny party landing on Alki Beach, there's just a handful of non-natives who can claim that history to this region. It's a very narrow, perspective, and it's also a very thin layer of history that can be claimed by non-natives, whereas natives can claim virtually everything you see everything you feel and touch, has a unique place in our place that we call home, because we can still say that, regardless, even post-treaty, even post-reservation time, we can still call this place home, whereas non-natives can't. And I would, I get it. I mean, I wouldn't want to go to England and try to tell them their history. I wouldn't want to go to Europe and tell them, who they are and where they come from. I'm sure I'd get the finger. I'm sure I'd get a lot of things. Those of us who are familiar with who we are and where we come from, not just 2 or 3 generations back, but going way, way back. We take it adds a level of pride. It really amplifies our identity. It amplifies our pride. It amplifies our need to fight. It amplifies our need to know and share, to help people understand why the tribes care so much about this area, why the tribal people, why the natives really do seem to, will fight to their last breath about land, about resources.
Speaking on that, so we did an archaeology dig on the Connell's Prairie site, the battlegrounds here, and we had all the tribes. We had Muckleshoot, Nisqually, Squaxin Island came up, Snoqualmie came down. But I've done probably 100 or so archaeology digs in my career, but none were as powerful as this one, because at this site we discovered charcoal and flakes, they were making projectile points, they were making weaponry here. And so I knew, we could tell that this was a preparation site. The natives here were preparing for battle. And so knowing that I was a descendant of Hainuk, I knew there was a strong possibility that I was standing and digging and touching artifacts that were personally connected to my family. But here at Connell's Prairie, with my great-great-great-great-grandfather Hainuk on site, preparing for battle, I was standing where he was standing 100 years ago.
All of these statements are really resonating with me, and what I was thinking about, the theme of frustration and walking 2 paths in growing up Native, and how that really influences, I think, all Native people really throughout their childhood. And I think part of the frustration that happens is that when these histories are covered in schools or wherever, it's often covered in a way that's very removed from the reality that these are real people with descendants today, with real connections that continue to this day to the land, to the history, and all of its implications. And it's funny because I personally actually didn't know a lot about the Treaty Wars specifically until very recently, until I started working for the tribe. What I think about is growing up, going to school, hearing maybe bits and pieces of tribal history, but being very frustrated about how it was told, feeling like it wasn't the story that my family had, or it talked about us like some far off people, and thinking about the experience of all Native youth, I think, in the school system or just in their day-to-day, that we put this burden on Native youth, not even purposefully, to represent this history and to carry it with them. By educating the non-Native population and community about these histories, we're giving them an opportunity to lift some of that burden off of our Native youth and allow them to kind of just be kids who don't have to fight to see themselves represented in their schooling and their education. My personal experience with learning about the Treaty Wars, growing up in Pierce County, growing up on the reservation, and then even moving away from the reservation for middle school and high school, I always heard about what I now know was the Treaty Wars, but at the time were just family stories. They were just talking about ancestors who fought for everything we have, ancestors who sacrificed everything, and how we might not understand the decisions they made, but we know that they made the best possible decision for our people, for their descendants at that time. My Sapa, my grandpa, used to always tell us about how we had one ancestor who shot 2 militia with 1 bullet. And this was like this kind of dark sense of pride that my Sapa would talk about. And we always thought, well, that's crazy. It was 1 bullet and 2 guys. And as I have learned more about the treaty wars, I've seen the opposite end of that story. And it was a really big deal. And I had no idea that those stories were about the treaty wars when I was growing up hearing them, because they were just family stories. They were just things that my aunts and uncles and Sapa and Kayaks just talked about. And now I'm seeing that they're part of a much bigger picture that is both personal, but also incredibly impactful to the local and national history. These histories that we talk about are often disconnected from the very personal experiences, very familial stories for Native people in this area.
Yeah. So there was a word that Charlotte used. I loved what she had to say, by the way. That was wonderful story. And thank you for sharing that, Charlotte. There was a word, disconnect. For the past, I'm going to say 4, 5 generations, there has been this disconnect from this important historical event. This is one thing that we can proudly bring back to common knowledge, that we can bring to the dinner table and that we can bring into our circle. This event is something that was kind of been suppressed for generations, and it really is long overdue to bring the value and the importance of the Medicine Creek Treaty War. And I think the other word is really humbling. I mean, we couldn't be prouder descendants of these warriors who have sacrificed so much to create these opportunities for us, and so that we can continue our trail of being Indian in the Puget Sound. It's just amazing work, and so I'm really happy about the direction that this work is taking everybody, bringing us, although we are distant relatives, but bringing relatives together once again to re-announce our strong ancestral backgrounds.
So first of all, the experience that I had as a Native person was actually not as a Native person. I'm over 60 years old. In my time, we went to school in these schools that were very racist, prejudiced. There was like 8 Native students in there. In going to school, you didn't even know you were Native. My parents were in survival mode. They worked out in the fields. They worked from morning to evening. So there was never any culture in our home or in the school. I've talked about the story of my grandma telling my mom that she didn't teach them the language or their culture because she didn't want them getting into trouble. So none of that was ever passed on. So we never knew there was a treaty war because we were not raised Native. We were in a white school, white teachers, white students. What we learned in school was like the Battle of Little Bighorn, that wasn't even near here. We had no idea there was a treaty war. You weren't really living on a reservation. There was 3 houses on our reservation. My grandma's was one. My aunt lived in one, and there was a shack that was on the reservation. That was all. There was no water, no electricity. My aunts, my mom, uncles, everybody, they lived off the res. They rented houses in towns that's what we grew up in. Like I tell people, in my time, sports was the biggest thing. Nothing was ever culturally relevant at the time. The other generations started questioning, like, well, yeah, we need to bring our culture back, our language, all of this thing. That wasn't even, in my, I guess, agenda. So my sons were raised that way. They were raised to go to school, my brothers, sisters. did sports. That was what they thought culture was. In my world, I wasn't raised as a Native until later on, when you actually got out of school. You actually were worried about, well, what do my kids know? And then after the tribe started getting tribal building, tribal funding, when the culture came in and you started trying to get away from the boarding schools into tribal schools, it helped you to bring all of that history back. But, Leshai to us was just Leshai. There was no understanding that he was just this bigger than life person. He was just Leshai to us. And then until you understand what he gave up, what he sacrificed, right along with a lot of our other elders, did you understand, the extent of this? My whole experience was just different. Like I said, it was more non-Native than Native because of everything that was taken away.
So I was blessed by having a family that was very connected to activities within the tribe. My mother was our tribal chair, and we were able to put together a program with our local community college that was basically an anthropological apprenticeship program. So for 2 years, I was learning cultural anthropology and getting paid for my time as well. So when I finished high school, I was able to go into a place where I was actually making money to attend school. But the desire was we needed our own experts. It was because we had hired non-Indian lawyers and worked with them throughout this process and relied on the little documented history that was out there that was, for the most part, always coming from the wrong perspective and not one that provided the true history supported by the people, that we needed our own people to tell the stories. That kicked me off in a good way, provided me an opportunity to begin a journey that allowed me to challenge things. I was happy to finish my apprenticeship in 2 years and get my associate's degree and quit school and not go back to school and just do whatever I needed to do to be a part of the world. But I had some great influencers that were a part of that program that caused me to go on. And there was an anthropologist who had done some work on the Puget Sound area that felt bad about the work he had done because he'd been hired by the U.S. government to do this work and realized it painted the tribal people in a negative way. And so one of my projects at Western Washington University working with him was to challenge his work and basically rewrite some of the things that he had done. And he welcomed that opportunity and so allowed me to use him as a resource, but correct some of that stuff. So that's been a part of how I've moved forward. I had people that encouraged me to challenge the inaccuracies in the history and provide my own tribal input into that and shed some new light on the story.
Thank you for joining us for the first episode of the Indigenous Voices Podcast. Be sure to listen to part 2 when we ask our panelists how they first learned about the Treaty War. We also discuss how the non-Native telling of the war has shifted over time. To learn more about the Puget Sound Treaty War, visit our tribal partner websites and fortnisqually.org, where you can watch our 4-part panel series on the conflict. This podcast is generously supported by the Tacoma Historic Preservation Office and Tacoma Arts Commission. Music by Vincent Johnson, Nooksack Lummi, and Nashani Johnson, Jamestown Sklallam Lummi.